The Quiet Panic. You guys have been absolutely begging me to cover this story for months now. I kept putting it off because honestly, it's one of those situations that still gives me chills just thinking about it. But after going through hundreds of your comments and messages, I finally decided it was time to share what happened to my neighbor's family last spring. It was one of those perfect Saturday mornings in early May. You know, the kind where the weather's just starting to warm up, birds are chirping, and everything feels peaceful. My neighbor Sarah had been excited all week because she'd finally finished building this elaborate rabbit hutch in her backyard for her daughter Emma's pet rabbits. Emma was only 8 years old, and those two little Holland lops were basically her entire world. I remember hearing Emma's laughter from my kitchen window as she fed the rabbits their morning carrots. Sarah had done an incredible job on that hutch. It was this beautiful wooden structure with multiple levels, proper ventilation, and even a little ramp connecting the upper and lower sections. She'd spent weeks researching the best designs online and probably dropped close to $300 on materials. The thing looked more like a miniature mansion than a simple rabbit cage. Around 10 that morning, I was working in my garden when I heard Emma calling for her mom. Nothing unusual at first, just typical kid stuff. But then her voice got more urgent, more panicked. I looked up from my tomato plants and saw Emma standing by the hutch, pointing at something and backing away slowly. Sarah came rushing out of the house, and I could hear her asking Emma what was wrong. Emma kept saying something about the rabbits acting weird, but I couldn't make out all the details from where I was standing. Sarah approached the hutch cautiously, and that's when I saw her freeze completely. She stood there for what felt like forever, just staring into the cage. Then she grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward their back door. I'd never seen Sarah move that fast before. She was practically dragging Emma inside, and I could hear her telling Emma to stay in the house and not come back outside. The urgency in Sarah's voice made my stomach drop. This wasn't normal parental concern, this was fear. I set down my gardening tools and walked closer to the fence that separated our yards. From my new angle, I could see the rabbit hutch more clearly, but everything looked normal from the outside. The structure was intact. The door was properly latched, and I could see both rabbits moving around inside. But something was definitely off about their behavior. Normally, Coco and Marshmallow were these calm, gentle creatures that would hop around peacefully or sit quietly munching on their food. But now they were pressed against the far corner of the hutch, huddled together like they were trying to hide from something. Their ears were pinned back, and I could see their little bodies trembling even from my distance. Sarah came back outside about 5 minutes later, this time carrying a long wooden pole that she usually used for pruning her apple tree. She approached the hutch slowly, holding the pole out in front of her like some kind of weapon. I wanted to call out and ask if everything was okay, but something told me to stay quiet and just watch. She used the pole to tap on the side of the hutch, making a sharp knocking sound. The rabbits immediately bolted to the opposite corner, their movements frantic and desperate. But that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a third shadow moving inside the hutch. At first I thought maybe it was just the way the sunlight was hitting the structure, creating weird shadows between the different levels. But as Sarah continued tapping with the pole, this shadow moved independently from the rabbits. It was darker than their shadows, and it seemed to flow rather than hop or scurry like you'd expect from a small animal. Sarah must have seen it too, because she dropped the pole and stumbled backward. She stood there for several seconds, just staring at the hutch with her hand covering her mouth. Then she turned and ran back into the house, leaving the pole lying in the grass. I didn't see Sarah or Emma for the rest of that day. Their car was gone by early afternoon, and it didn't return until late Sunday evening. When I finally ran into Sarah at the mailbox on Monday morning, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she kept glancing nervously toward her backyard. I asked her if everything was all right, and she just shook her head and said they'd had some trouble with the rabbit hutch over the weekend. When I pressed for more details, she got this haunted look in her eyes and told me she didn't really want to talk about it. But then she asked me something that still bothers me to this day. She wanted to know if I'd noticed anything strange in my yard lately. Any unusual sounds at night, things moved around, or animals acting weird. I told her no. Everything seemed normal on my side of the fence, but her question got me thinking about some odd things I'd dismissed over the past few weeks. There had been a few nights where I'd heard scratching sounds coming from somewhere outside my bedroom window. I'd assumed it was just raccoons getting into the garbage cans, or maybe a stray cat. And there was that morning about 2 weeks earlier when I'd found my bird feeder completely empty, even though I'd filled it the night before. The strange part was that there were no seeds scattered on the ground underneath it, like something had carefully consumed every single seed without spilling any. Sarah mentioned that Emma refused to go anywhere near the backyard now. She'd been having nightmares and kept asking when they could move the rabbits somewhere else. But here's the thing that really got to me. Sarah said the rabbits had been acting strange for almost a week before that Saturday morning, but she'd assumed they were just adjusting to their new home. She told me that several times during that week she'd gone out to check on them and found both rabbits pressed against the same corner of the hutch, staring at the opposite end like they were watching something. But whenever she looked in that direction, there was nothing there, just empty space and the wooden wall of the hutch. The scratching sounds I'd been hearing at night suddenly made a lot more sense. My bedroom window faced Sarah's backyard, and if something had been lurking around that rabbit hutch after dark, I probably would have heard it moving around. The thought of some unknown creature prowling around just 30 feet from where I slept made my skin crawl. But what really disturbed me was Sarah's description of that shadow she'd seen moving inside the hutch. She said it wasn't like any animal shadow she'd ever seen before. It moved too smoothly, almost like it was floating rather than walking. And it seemed to respond to her presence, moving away from wherever she positioned herself around the hutch. That's when she told me about the smell. She said that when the wind shifted in a certain direction, there was this awful odor coming from the area around the hutch. Not like typical animal smells or even something dead and rotting. She described it as sweet but wrong, like fruit that had gone bad in a way that fruit shouldn't be able to go bad. I'll be honest, at that point I was starting to think Sarah might be letting her imagination run wild. It's easy to freak yourself out when you're worried about your kids' pets, and sometimes perfectly normal things can seem sinister when you're already on edge. But then she showed me the photos she'd taken that Saturday morning and everything changed. The photos on Sarah's phone were grainy and taken from a distance, but they showed something that made my mouth go dry. In the corner of the hutch where the rabbits kept avoiding, there was definitely something there. It wasn't clear enough to make out exactly what it was, but it had this weird texture that didn't match anything else in the frame. The shadows fell wrong around it, like light was bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. Sarah zoomed in on one particular photo and I could see what looked like wet patches on the wooden floor of the hutch. She said those stains hadn't been there when she'd cleaned the cage just 2 days before. They formed this irregular pattern that reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place what. Then she swiped to the next photo and I felt my stomach lurch. It was a close-up shot of the hutch's wire mesh, and there were these long scratches gouged into the metal. Not from the inside like you'd expect if the rabbits had been trying to escape, but from the outside. Something had been clawing its way in. The scratches were too deep and too precise to be from any normal animal. They ran in parallel lines, each one about 6 inches long, and they'd torn right through the galvanized coating on the wire. Sarah said she'd noticed them for the first time that Saturday morning when Emma had called her outside. But here's what really made my blood freeze. In the background of one photo, you could just barely make out what looked like a handprint pressed against the glass of Sarah's kitchen window. It was taken from inside the hutch looking toward the house, which meant something had been in there with the rabbits when she took the picture. Sarah admitted she hadn't noticed the handprint until she was looking through the photos later that evening. She'd gone back to check the window, and sure enough, there were smudge marks on the glass that definitely hadn't been there that morning. The print was too large to be Emma's and too small to be an adult human's. That's when she decided they needed to get the rabbits out of there immediately. She called her brother, who lived about 20 minutes away, and he came over Sunday morning to help move Coco and Marshmallow to a temporary setup in his garage. Sarah said the rabbits were so traumatized that they barely moved during the entire relocation process. Her brother took one look at the hutch and told Sarah she needed to call someone. He'd been in construction for 15 years and had never seen scratches like that on wire mesh. The metal was industrial grade, designed to keep out foxes and other predators. Whatever had made those marks was either incredibly strong or had claws unlike anything he'd encountered. But Sarah was terrified of involving authorities or animal control. She was convinced that if she reported it, they'd think she was crazy, and maybe even take Emma away for being in an unsafe environment. So instead, she decided to just abandon the hutch and pretend the whole thing never happened. For the next few weeks, everything seemed to return to normal. The strange scratching sounds outside my window stopped, and Sarah gradually began letting Emma play in the backyard again. The rabbit hutch just sat there empty, and honestly, I started to forget about the whole incident. Then about a month later, I was mowing my lawn on a Tuesday evening when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The hutch wasn't empty anymore. There was something moving around inside it, but it definitely wasn't a rabbit. I shut off the mower and walked closer to the fence. Whatever was in there was much larger than Coco or Marshmallow had been, and it moved in this unsettling way that reminded me of Sarah's description of that floating shadow. It seemed to sense my presence because it immediately retreated to the far corner where the rabbits used to hide. I called Sarah's name, but there was no answer from the house. Their car was in the driveway, so I knew they were home. I called again, louder this time, and that's when Emma appeared at their back door. She took one look at me standing by the fence and started crying hysterically. Sarah came running outside and immediately saw what I was looking at. Without saying a word, she grabbed Emma and rushed back into the house. I heard multiple locks clicking into place, and then all the lights in their house went out even though it was still daylight. I stood there for another few minutes watching the hutch. Whatever was inside had gone completely still, but I could feel it watching me back. The same sweet, wrong smell that Sarah had described began drifting across the yard, and I finally understood why she'd been so terrified. That was the last time I saw Sarah and Emma. Their house went up for sale 3 days later, and they were gone by the end of the week. The new owners demolished the rabbit hutch on their first day, but I heard from the realtor that they found something buried underneath it that made them call the police. I never found out what they discovered, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. But sometimes late at night, I still hear scratching sounds outside my bedroom window. And every morning I check my bird feeder just to make sure it's still full. The thing is, whatever was in that hutch, I don't think it ever really left. It just found a new place to hide.